No problem. Where he is ultimately to spend 40 days receiving the Torah. When I look at the variety and diversity of the laws within Mishpatim, I do see two common themes, even though I don't see a legal thread connecting them. One of those themes is accountability, and the other is dignity. So, not every single one of the laws, but I do see that a lot of the laws ultimately or in some way deal with accountability and or with dignity. And what I'd like to do in our time this morning, we have about 40 minutes left, is start presenting some of the laws that are here in Mishpatim. During that time, if you have a question, if you have a comment, if you have a reflection, please throw it into the chat. Like I said, I will do my best to keep an eye on the chat during our time together. Mara, please, if you have an opportunity to keep an eye on the chat too, if you see a couple of questions or threads coming up, please throw them my way. And we can make this as much of an interactive back and forth. If you would like to open up a copy of the text on your own screen or your own browser, you can do it here. You can do it from Safari. I'm also going to share my screen with the verses as well. All right, share screen. I will share that. There we go. Okay, so right at the beginning, we have a few verses which, in many ways, are quite troubling from a contemporary lens when we if and when we want to look at the Torah not just as a legal code, also as a sort of ethics and values. And it's a little bit troubling because the opening verses in this parsha talk about owning a slave, which again is really complicated for us in many levels, right? So here we have the first verse. These are the rules that you shall set before them. These are the rules. Ele hamishpatim. These are the rules. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, and I'm going to hold on to that word slave for a moment. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, that person shall serve 6 years and shall go free in the 7th year without payment. So again, putting the word slave aside, which is very, very difficult to do, I understand that. Putting the word slave aside for the moment, we're already starting to see that there are laws in and around slavery that, as almost crazy as it seems to say, do try to preserve some of the dignity of the slave as a human being, that they serve for 6 years and then they go free in the 7th year. This is not lifetime enslavement. And as we see in verse 3, if the male slave came single, then he leaves single. And if he had a wife, his wife leaves with him. Okay. Um, if you jump down to verse 5, if the slave declares, I love my master and my wife and children, and I do not wish to go free, then the slave master can you actually pierce his ear with an awl, as you see in verse 6, and then he can remain the master slave for life. So I know that these are troubling verses because we don't like thinking about Jews in slavery and having slaves. So a couple of things that I would like to bring up. First of all, I'm not an apologist. In other words, Judaism has difficult texts as part of Judaism. The Torah recounts events going back as far as 3,000 and 3,500 years. We know that life was different 3,500 years ago from how it is today. We know that ethics and values from 3,000 years ago are different from what they are today. In addition, right. So what's considered acceptable then is somewhat different from what's considered acceptable now. And this is part of our text. And rather than ignoring it, rather than dismissing it, rather than hiding it, rather than pretending it doesn't exist, I'd rather engage with it and wrestle with it. And I'm seeing in the chat already a couple of different reframes, perhaps, or different understandings of what we're really talking about here. An awl, by the way, is kind of like a wooden post or like a wooden nail, and you kind of bore it into the ear. So you're really creating a piercing. And I think part of the reason that the Torah talks about making a hole in the ear is because in the time of the Torah, the idea of doing something to one's body, like any kind of body change, alteration, or mutilation, is considered indignifying. And I think part of the reason that they say that if a slave wants to stay with the master for his life, that you put a hole in his ear is because that's an indignifying act. And that, I think, is one way that the Torah can try to suggest that a person's dignity is really central, that we don't want to be in a servitude role. And I'm seeing here in the chat that perhaps some of a different way to understand this is more like serfdom or indentured servitude. And I think that's the Torah's larger understanding of what it means for an Israelite or a Hebrew to be a slave. That this is really someone who has come into economic hardship and is unable to support himself and or his family. And by the way, I keep using the male gendered language because in the times of the Torah, when they're referring to a slave, in this context, it's really male slaves only. As a default, I do not use male gendered language when referring to laws from the Torah, and certainly not to God. But in this unique case, this law is applying to male slaves. So I think indentured servitude is a better way to understand this, that this is a person who's come into economic hardship, can't support himself, can't support his family. So he goes and effectively is an indentured servant to a master. The master has obligations to treat the slave properly. You may not abuse the slave. You may not mistreat the slave. You must provide him and or his family with shelter, with clothing, and this is only for a finite number of years. And then hopefully that person is in a better economic situation where he can then leave the servitude and then continue to go on his life. So I think this is still complicated in many ways. And I really do believe that here the Torah is trying to distinguish between the dehumanizing enslavement that the Israelites experienced in Egypt and saying, you Israelites know what dehumanizing enslavement means. If there comes a time when someone is falling under you and you are effectively their legal and financial master, you have a different set of obligations for how to treat that person, in part based on your horrifying and dehumanizing generations of experience. You have different obligations, and you must still treat the person under your guardianship with dignity and care. So these are some of the opening verses. I I see there are a lot of different comments and reflections, and thank you. My eyes were not able to scroll through all of them. So Mara, I don't want to completely put all this on your shoulders. Was there anything or any thread that you saw recurring quite a bit that you think I should take a couple moments to address?
Lots of thoughts and reframing of how to look at this in today's context. I saw someone's comment, and I actually can't find it. This text is looking at if it's a daughter, would it be a different situation if it were a son?
Yes. So again, in those days, you would take so the women in those days would kind of either be with their parents or in their husband's house. This is very gendered binary language. It's not the Judaism that I practice, that I espouse in 2025. And there are Jews who do still have gender roles within Judaism. I'm not saying one is good, bad, better, worse, or right or wrong. That's simply not my Judaism today. And 3,000 years ago, that's how Judaism was. So it would be the male who would be a slave. If he were married and or had children, and one of those children were a daughter, the family would come along with him. And then the slave master would still have the ethical obligations to treat the entire family properly. But a daughter independently would not be brought on as a slave, because in those days, women did not earn money and did not work. So they would not be brought on as a slave that way. Anything else, Mara, that is jumping out?
Muted. I think we can continue.
Okay, great. Now, that being said, I believe a parent could sell a child as a slave, in which case, and then they could sell a son or a daughter, but then the financial transaction is still with the parent, and then the slave owner still does have obligations toward the woman who was sold as a slave to. And once again, I put my email into the chat. And actually, one quick clarification. I see women didn't work. It's not that they didn't work. It's that they were not paid for work in those days. All right, let's jump down to something that I'm sure we have heard many, many times. Sometimes named is in Hammurabi's code, where we see here in Exodus 21, we see that the penalty should be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. So on a very, very basic literal level, this means that if I do something to you, and if I injure you, and the consequence of my injuring you is that you lose a tooth, on a literal level, I should have a tooth removed from me. And on a very surface level, that makes a lot of sense, right? Whatever I do to you, that should be done to me, right? Like quid pro quo, right? If because of something I do, you lose a hand, and in punishment, I lose a fingernail, that's not fair. That's not right, right? The damage that I caused you far surpasses the consequence that I feel for myself. So, on a literal level, whatever I do to you, that punishment is done to me. The rabbis are very clear in their understanding of this, that it is not intended to be absolutely literal. That it's not intended to say that if I poke out your eye, I in turn get my eye poked out. They're very, very clear about that. And let's think of a concrete example. Imagine that I am someone who doesn't have the blessing of sight, right? I can hear, I can smell, I can taste, I can touch, I can walk. The rest of my body is in peak mint condition, and I'm blind. And let's say in a fit of rage, I poke out an eye of yours. If you poke out an eye of mine, that's not equal. It's equal on the most literal level because each of us loses an eye, but on a practical level, right? I mean, my body has been disfigured a little bit. Now I need to wear an eye patch, but I don't lose anything in terms of a gift of sight, whereas you do. Let's say you are a famous violinist or concert pianist, and I break a finger of yours. In turn, breaking a finger of mine, if I am a teacher, is a far different consequence, right? You are a professional violinist, you're a professional pianist, you're no longer able to perform, you're no longer able to earn a living, you're no longer able to subsist. You break my finger as a teacher of mine. Okay, it's a little harder for me to type on chat and Zoom, but other than that, it doesn't affect my teaching at all. Right? So we talk here that the repercussions for an act can only really be measured monetarily. And that is an imperfect way. That being said, we are to say that if I were to damage your eye, what is the value of the eye to you? And then how much do I have to compensate you for it? Right? So I have a problem with rage and I break the fingers on two different people. Hopefully, part of my consequence is in some way removing me from a place where I can continue to hurt other people. And hopefully, part of that is helping me to deal with rage in a different way so that I do not hurt people anymore. And I might have to pay out a different amount to each of you. Again, if one person's a concert pianist and another is a teacher, I might have to pay out a different financial sum to each of you because the value of a finger is different for each of you. So, according to the rabbis, when the Torah says eye for eye, tooth for tooth, etc., they're not talking literally. Rather, they are trying to suggest that I need to compensate you, not with an understanding. Again, money cannot compensate for everything, but what would be the financial value of the damage that I did to you? How do I measure that with money? And then how do I try to compensate you for it monetarily? And again, this to me really falls both under accountability and dignity. Accountability, if I do something wrong, I need to be responsible, and certainly dignity, because just harming another person and their physical body really also indignifies them too, right? Maybe you're a professional actor or actress or thespian, right? And doing something to your body also affects your quality of life, but also affects your self esteem. How do I measure that as well? And how do I compensate you? And again, you can't compensate for indignifying another person. And the best measure that the rabbis have is financial compensation. Questions, comments, reflections about that? Mara, is there something that you saw that was jumping out in the chat? And I really appreciate all of the comments and all of reflections here.
Just a lot of gratitude that we can talk through some of these more difficult texts.
Oh, great, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the least studied books in the Tanakh, the Jewish Bible, is the book of Joshua. It is the first book that takes place right after the Torah, and it leads Joshua's conquest of the land that is then called Canaan, and now that we would call modern day Israel. And I think it's one of the least studied books because it is a militaristic, and violent, and in some ways very unforgiving book for the conquest of the land. And I think one of the reasons we skip over it is we just don't want to deal with it. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want to say that thousands of years ago, the ancient Israelites, under God's direction, were pretty violent when conquering the land. And again, we can try to contextualize it, and we can try to understand it from the language of 3,000 years ago, and we can try to understand how perhaps the Israelites, violent by modern standards, were still much more humane by contemporary standards of those times. We can suggest that it's wrong. I think we have an obligation to engage with the multiplicity of texts, because I think by shunning them and hiding them, we actually indignify ourselves. I think Judaism has so much wisdom for us. And I don't want to suggest that every single thing that has ever been taught throughout the thousands of years of Jewish history is perfect as it is. Sometimes we need to understand it, and sometimes we actually need to set a couple of things aside and say that exact language doesn't really work in contemporary times. And how do we still wrestle with it and engage it? So thank you for your comments there as well. All right, now we're going to jump to a passage that always brings a little bit of a smile to my face for a moment. We talk about stealing an ox or stealing a sheep, and it brings a smile to it because of the end of the verse. This is at the top of the screen that I'm sharing, chapter 21, verse 37. And it brings a smile to my face because of a rabbinic interpretation of this. When any party steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, you shall pay 5 oxen for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. On the surface, this seems to make some sense, right? You own a couple of oxen or you own a couple of sheep. I go and I steal an ox from you, right? You are now down an ox. You are now out work today. You are now out time today because you need to try to figure out what happened to the ox. Did it accidentally wander off? Was it my fault? How do I know if somebody stole it? What, and then what do I do to replace the ox? I have to go find another ox. I have to integrate it within the rest of my team of oxen. I have a lot of time that I have to put in. It's a lot of energy. It's a lot of mental anguish. It's a lot of service. It's a lot of stress. So if I steal an ox from you, I'm actually causing more than quote unquote 1 ox of damage. It's a loss of time, it's a loss of labor, it's a loss of work, it's a loss of energy, and it creates a lot of stress. So as the thief, I'm obligated to compensate you, not just for the value of the ox, but also for all of the chain of events that leads to. Right? In modern days, I'm not a lawyer. So if there's a lawyer here or someone more familiar with US law, please correct me. But I think that's often called or referred to as pain and suffering, right? That sometimes there's the damage caused by an injury and or by a theft. And then there's also pain and suffering. There's also kind of secondary damages for which one can also be compensated as well, right? So if I steal an ox from you, the compensation is 5-fold. And if I steal a sheep from you, then the compensation is 4-fold. As Margot suggests, that is a pretty cheap price to pay. That joke, Margot, is not so bad, right? So we do have the extra payments. The rabbis then ask, why is it that if you steal an ox, you pay it 5-fold, whereas if you steal a sheep, you pay it 4-fold? Right? On the one hand, that's not fair to the sheep. So on the most basic level, the response is, look, an ox does more valuable work than a sheep does. Okay? Which is fair enough. Then the rabbis, though, also have a wonderful commentary. And this is what makes me smile. And this is where I see that human dignity is so central to the laws. The rabbis say that if I go and steal an ox, the only way I can do it is to, put a noose or something around its neck and lead it out. If I steal a sheep, however, the way that I can steal a sheep is by lifting the sheep, putting it around my neck, what we would now call a fire person's carry, and I can walk away with the sheep. And because of that, it's indignifying to me as a thief to have a sheep draped around my neck. So I am already, quote unquote, paying for the theft with a little piece of my dignity. And because of that, I only need to pay 4 sheep because part of my punishment is my loss of dignity by walking around with the sheep around my neck. Now, we can agree or we can disagree with the idea of indignifying and carrying a sheep, but I bring that up partly because it brings a smile to my face to imagine like a thief running around with a sheep around their neck, but also because this is really just another example of the value that the rabbis place on human dignity. That the idea that I'd be indignifying myself as a thief, that also has monetary and compensatory value. I love the other puns that are coming up here. Thank you so much. That they also bring a huge smile to my face as I was reading through the chats. Mara, I saw you smiling a couple of times, so I'm guessing you're looking at the puns as well. Were there other questions or comments specifically about that verse that you saw come up?
I have to say, I think I was distracted by the puns.
Excellent. That's always great too.
Yes. So I
Okay.
think if you'd like to pause for questions, we can invite people to raise their hands, or if we have more text to go to, we can keep moving.
Okay, no, there's always more text. So why don't we keep going? And if more comments come in, and once again, I've put my email down in there, and you can feel free to email me as well. I'd like to jump down to chapter 22, verse 20. If you'd like, you can also go to chapter 23, verse 9. The reason I say this is because this injunction, you shall not wrong or oppress a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. This injunction appears in the Torah in slightly different language, but this injunction appears in the Torah more than any other injunction. It appears 36 times in the Torah. For the mathematicians among us, we know that 36 is twice 18. And for the other gematria mathematicians, gematria is the idea that every Hebrew letter has a numerical value. You might know that the number 18 is the numerical value for the Hebrew word chai. Chai is chet yud. Chet is the 8th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Yud is the 10th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. 8 plus 10 is 18. So the rabbis teach that the number 18 represents life. So the idea that the injunction that you shall not oppress a stranger, for you are a stranger in the land of Egypt, that appears 36 times, first of all, is essential because it appears more than anything else. In some ways, there's no more message for you Israelites to learn that the indignification, the dehumanization that you experienced as slaves in Egypt, you may not do that to anyone else. You are accountable to change the pattern of behavior. The trauma that you endured, the abuse that you endured, it is up to you to break that cycle. That is your accountability. It's not about doing to others the suffering that you endured, which we know is very, very much human nature. It's about you breaking the cycle. And we know that this is human nature in terms of trauma, right? That trauma that a child experiences in their home, it's not uncommon for that child to perpetuate that in their lives and if they have children. And it's also the case on very small levels as well. During the summers when I was in rabbinical school, I worked at Camp Ramah in New England. I had many roles. My first role was a Rosh Hashanah as a unit head for campers going into 10th grade. And there was a practice that a camper who was caught sneaking out at night after they were supposed to be in bed would be made to kind of run laps around the field and then kind of do push-ups. And my first night that I was on Shmirah, that I was kind of up late, making sure the campers were still on their bunks, a camper was out there, and one of the staff people said, "Okay, now it was a male camper. Now he has to go run laps." And I'm watching this, and I'm like, "This is nonsensical." Right? So I said, "Why are we making this person run laps?" And they said, "Well, that's how it's always been here. When I was a camper and I snuck out, I would have to run laps." I said, "This doesn't make any sense. First of all, this camper is now the center of attention, right? They're kind of getting positive attention. Then other campers who are asleep are now woken up because he's running laps in the field. The staff are all hooting and hollering and laughing. So now we're waking people up. Everybody's watching. And all this does is in some ways gives an incentive to somebody else to sneak out because now they're center of attention. It's the reason why networks have stopped showing when a fan runs onto a sports field. because we're giving them positive attention, right? So the idea that just because this is how we used to do it is how we should continue to do it, we often practice what we have learned, right? So here, one of the ideas, do not oppress a stranger. That's what you learned. We can break that cycle. The other idea is that this here appears 36 times because when we refrain from oppression, when we find a different way of treating people, we diametrically and powerfully affect their life. Remember, 36 is 18 times 2. Not only do we affect their life, which is one life, which is 18, we also transform our lives. By treating someone else with dignity, we not only have a positive and perhaps immeasurable impact on them, we also have a positive impact on ourselves. Those are the double lives that we affect by treating someone else kindly. We talk often about altruism as a virtue. I'm not the biggest believer in altruism as a virtue, right? If someone asks me for kindness and I have the capacity to extend that kindness, and I do so with an open and loving heart, I think it's okay that I feel good about it. In fact, I think it's important that I feel good about it because we know how the human brain and human consciousness works. If I feel good about it, I have an incentive to do it again, right? If someone asks me for, if someone asks me for money, I tend to be the kind of person who I try to carry some food with me or have some granola bars or something in my car, and I try to offer that instead. Whether that's good, bad, right, wrong, better, or worse, we can have that conversation another time. That's the practice that I've tried to make, and I try to do it with a smile. I try to say, "Will this help? Have a good day. You're welcome." Right? According to Rambam, if one gives tzedakah ungraciously, if one gives charity ungraciously, you still get the mitzvah points for giving. I can say, "Here's your granola bar," throw it at them, and drive away, and I still get the points for tzedakah, right? But I don't think I would be getting the points of this verse in Exodus, right? Because if I do it with graciousness, if I try to treat people with dignity, I think that has a positive impact on them. And it has a positive impact on me. I now am a person who tries to practice treating people well at all times. Hopefully, I feel good about that. Hopefully, I do more about that. And then hopefully, the cycle and legacy that I can pass on to people in my sphere of influence, including my 2 kids, this is how I believe people should be treated. And so the ancient Israelites, not to minimize the trauma they experienced as slaves, but if you ancient Israelites can take that trauma and transform that into dignity, that is going to have an immeasurable impact on the people you are interacting with, on yourselves, and on future generations. And so it is 2 lives that are impacted when you treat other people well, the recipient of your kindness and your life as well. Questions, comments, reflections about that? Anything, Mara, that you saw that jumped up that I should give some attention to?
Folks are adding some additional resources for readings that feel relevant to these texts. But no questions right now.
Okay, amazing. All right. We have a few more minutes, and I know we're pretty punctual, ending at 11:15 Eastern time. So we have a few more minutes left. So let's go through another couple text or two. Let's jump down just a couple of verses later, verses 25 and 26, also in chapter 22. And once again, this I think goes to human dignity. If you take a neighbor's garment in pledge, right? I am borrowing something from you. Here is my garment in pledge. You must return it before the sun sets, right? So I am borrowing. I am borrowing an all from you for some work that I have to do. I am giving you my effectively my hat, gloves, and jacket in pledge. Then it comes the end of the day, and I have not returned what I'm borrowing from you. You still have to return the garment to me. Why? In verse 26, it is the only available clothing I have. It's my only jacket or my only blanket. What else am I going to sleep under? Right? It's daytime. The sun is out. I'm working hard in the field. I'm getting a good sweat. I'm taking off my outer layers because it's so warm and I'm working so hard. The sun has begun to set. I come to you and I say, yeah, I don't have the all to return to you. Right? You still have to give me my jacket back. On the one hand, financially, that's entirely unfair to you. I am not acting with accountability. I am not returning what I borrowed from you, and yet I get my pledge back. Why? The sun is set. It's nighttime. It's cold out. I need my garment to sleep under so I can stay warm at night. There's still a level of dignity here that is required. And even if that comes at a financial cost to you, the value of dignity, of treating the other person kindly, is worth infinitely more than the cost of the item that you have lent. And for me, my physical well-being is so important that I should get my pledge back. Now, in doing so, I'm also indignifying myself a little bit because I am not being accountable. I now need to walk up to you and say, hey, I lost your all. Or, hey, I'm keeping it. Ha, ha, ha. You owe me my pledge back anyway. Right? So you might think I'm getting away with something for free. But as we learned earlier with the thief who's carrying the sheep around their shoulder, the price of human dignity has no measure. So even though I might be getting for free the value of what I borrowed, the cost of my dignity is worth far more than the item that I have stolen. Were there was anything that jumped out there?
Lots of things jumping out. I think Susie has had her hand raised. I think
Okay,
we have
please.
time for one question.
Great.
Great. Go ahead, Susie.
Thank you both. I think there's another cost to that person who doesn't return your all besides that indignity, which is no one will likely ever lend him anything again.
Oh, absolutely. Pirkei Avot teaches that Keter Shem Tov Gove al Kulam, that the value of a good name outweighs heritage, legacy, elections, public, anything. The value of a good name has no measure, right? So here, my trust, right? Being able to trust me, right? I might have stolen the all, but good luck when I try to borrow something else again. Yeah, thank you, Susie. Thank you, absolutely. Margot, you are really dropping the puns today. I love it. I've also done some comedy sports, some improv comedy as well. The pun games were always my favorite. So at some point, Margot, we should figure out a way to do some improv comedy together. Margot says it's all or nothing. So thank you very, very much, Margot. I put in the chat my email. I also run two organizations. I'm the founder and director of Own Your Judaism, where your life journey and your Jewish journey meet. We do local in-person programs, primarily in Milwaukee, and I do lots of national programs and teachings and workshops as well. Feel free to send me an email and/or to jump on that email list. Those emails come out about once a week. It's not too often. You can also follow me on Facebook. I'm also the director of Ohel Ayala, based in New York, where we offer free walk-in high holiday services and discounted community seders. So I'll be out in New York for the first night of Passover for an in-person Seder. And then I also have the wonderful opportunity and privilege to host the My Jewish Learning second night online Seder. So if you're in the My Jewish Learning Network, you'll get all that information. If you would like to jump on either or both of my email lists, again, I don't flood inboxes. You can follow us on Facebook or on Instagram. And we're happy to stay connected that way. So if you have any questions, comments, reflections, or you want to stay connected in any of those ways, please do feel free at any time. And once again, a huge thank you to Mara and to My Jewish Learning for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. We
join
have
you
1
today.
minute, and I've been in the practice of asking our Torah study leaders to leave us with a blessing as we go into Shabbat. So
Oh,
apologies for putting you on the spot, but
no, not
you could,
at all.
yeah.
Not at all. I've been thinking about eye for eye and tooth for tooth in particular this week. When we think of everything going on in the Middle East, and I know it's troubling, I know it's complicated, I know some people consider this Torah, some people consider it love, some people consider it politics. So I'm going to be a little bit more generalized than I might in other circles. When we think of everything going on in the Middle East, it is almost impossible for feelings of anger, hatred, and vengeance not to come up. And we really learn eye for eye that direct vengeance is not what the Torah teaches. And that somehow, despite the greatest traumas that people are feeling, the greatest blessing that we can have is figuring out how not to perpetuate the cycle of oppression. I don't have the answer. And I don't know how to say to someone in Middle East who is suffering unimaginable tragedy, put aside your emotions and access graciousness. But my deep hope and bracha is that hopefully in time, and hopefully maybe speedily in our day, that we're able to break the cycle of oppression and violence and vengeance and begin to access treating each other and everyone with the dignity that we all hope within ourselves.
Amen. Thank you so much, everyone. Wishing you a Shabbat of peace. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.